So we're going to launch right into the Abrahamic covenant. Now the situation is humanity is scattered over the face of the earth. They're alienated from each other. They're alienated from God. What's God going to do? God has already promised he can't send a flood anymore. So God adopts a different strategy. He's going to work with one man and that man's family, and through them spread blessing back through the rest of humankind. It's kind of an infiltration strategy beginning with this man, Abraham. And there's a very important verse in Genesis 12 when God first calls Abram as his servant, as the one that he's going to work with to restore that blessing to all of humanity. He says to Abraham, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who curses you I will curse. And by you all the families of the earth shall bless themselves. Okay? Now, in that verse there, that was Genesis 12, 2 and 3, we see basically three elements of a blessing that God is promising to Abraham. First of all, God is promising to him to make him into a great nation. So we'll get that down. And then God promises to Abraham a great name. And then finally, he promises to Abraham what I'm just going to term, for the sake of consistency, a great blessing, by which I mean a universal blessing. Through him, all of the families of the earth, not just Abraham, but all the families of the earth, the entire human race is going to experience blessing. So, great nation, great name, great blessing. These are the three elements of the promise given to Abraham when God calls him to rectify this sorry situation that humanity finds itself in. God then proceeds to take each of these promises and incorporate them sequentially into a binding covenant relationship with Abraham. So first of all, the promise of a great nation. It begins as just a promise. God incorporates it into a covenant a few chapters later in Genesis 15. There we get a very important episode that the Jewish tradition refers to as the covenant between the pieces. We actually read it at the beginning of Lent in lectionary year C. And it's a story of how God, in order to confirm Abraham's faith, told Abraham to take animals and cut them in half and lay them side by side on the ground. So, as you can see, we are doing a cow here, and this cow has been cut in half. That's the only animal sound I will make in this video series, so you may set your minds at rest about that. And when these animals are cut in half and laid on the ground, darkness falls, and God's presence appears in the form of a torch and a burning fire pot. And I'm just going to draw the torch, and the torch moves between the pieces of the animal. And while the torch and the fire pot, the smoke and the fire, which are traditional symbols of the presence of God, are moving through the animals, God pronounces these promises to Abraham, giving him the assurance of numerous descendants and an enormous area of land, the whole land that is called Canaan, from the Euphrates River all the way down to the border of Egypt. So what is going on here? Well, these promises of numerous descendants and of land, those are the two main ingredients that you need in order to become a great nation. So at the heart of this relationship that God is forming with Abraham is this promise. One day you're going to become this great nation to fill the whole land. But this ritual, isn't this a strange ritual? When I first read about this when I was 12 years old, you know, what came to mind is that passage from Huckleberry Finn where you had the cure for warts. Remember that? Where you swing a dead cat around your head at midnight in a graveyard. It's supposed to cure your warts. Like, what is something as weird as Mark Twain doing in the Bible? You know, rituals with dead animals at night, you know? What's going on here? Well, this is actually a very traditional ancient Near Eastern covenant-making ritual. There's a meaning to what's going on here. There's a meaning to the slaughtering of these animals. You see, when you walked between the pieces of the animal, you would pronounce promises as you entered into a covenant relationship. And the meaning was, if I don't keep the promises, the commitments that I'm making as part of this covenant, which recall is a family relationship that's being formed, if I don't keep the promises that I'm pronouncing right now through my lips, may I be killed like these animals through whose pieces I'm walking. Okay? That is the meaning of the ritual. And so God does what we call condescends. He comes down to a human level, although that's really not required of him, but he comes down, goes above and beyond what is required of him to assure Abraham of his constancy and the certainty of his promises. And God undergoes a human ritual here to assure Abraham that he will indeed become a great nation. Well, we said that's in Genesis chapter 15, but nothing is said yet in Genesis 15 about Abraham having a great name or the great blessing yet. These are going to come in subsequent chapters. So, a couple of chapters later, God comes back to Abraham and renews this covenant that was initially formed here in Genesis 15. This time, God has Abraham perform a different cutting ceremony, not cutting animals, but now cutting his own flesh. So you see how the ante is upped at this point. The ritual is becoming more solemn and more severe. So in this instance, God comes to Abraham and says, Abraham, I want you as a sign of the covenant to circumcise yourself. And so now circumcision poses certain challenges in terms of illustration. So we're just going to draw a knife. We'll leave it at that, and we'll remember what it was used for. But just as there was a meaning to the animal cutting ritual of chapter 15, there's also a meaning to the circumcision ritual in Genesis 17. And the meaning is this: as you circumcised yourself and cut this piece of flesh off of your body, what you were saying was, if I don't keep the commitments that I'm making as part of this covenant, may I be cut off like this piece of flesh that I'm cutting off from my body. Now, what did it mean to be cut off in the ancient world? Well, it was a phrase referring to death without any descendants, dying without leaving any heirs. And that was the worst curse imaginable in the ancient world, was to die and be forgotten and leave no family behind. And so that was the meaning of ritual. May I be cut off if I don't keep the commitment that I'm making. So God has assured his covenant faithfulness to Abraham through a ritual in Genesis 15. Abraham now has assured God of his covenant fidelity through this covenant ritual in Genesis 17. And after the ritual is performed, God changes Abram's name. Remember, Abram is called simply Abram up until this point, but now in Genesis 17, in conjunction with circumcision, his name is made greater. It's added an additional syllable. So now it's no longer Avram, but Avraham, or as we usually say, Abraham. So that larger name is a poetic way of indicating that this stage of the covenant is all about the great name. And then God includes in Genesis 17 the promise of royalty from Abram's line for the first time. And this is something we need to understand. The idiom great name in the ancient world was generally associated with kingship. If you had a great name, that meant you were royalty. So that's always just below the surface of this idea of having a great name, is the idea of a royal dynasty. And that indeed is promised to Abraham in Genesis 17 as God tells him kings will come from your line. So now, the promise of Abraham becoming a great nation has been solemnized by a sacred covenant. The promise of a great name has also been incorporated into this covenant relationship. And now for that promise of great blessing or blessing to all the earth, God is going to ask Abraham to cut something more precious than animals and something more precious than his own body. God is going to ask Abraham to cut the flesh of his own son. And that is an event that happens in Genesis 22, an event that the Jewish tradition calls the Akedah, The word akadah means binding. They refer to it as the binding of Isaac. Not the sacrifice of Isaac, because as you will recall, Isaac ends up not being sacrificed in this episode, even though Abraham and Isaac himself are willing to undergo a sacrifice. But that is a story that deserves its own treatment in our next segment.